bell choir. And I've got to say that since that, I've had not only a little more respect for the bell choir, because that congregation, they let me know that that wasn't appropriate, and it shouldn't have been appropriate. But I believe God speaks to us mightily, sometimes even when we are a long ways away from it. Let us pray. We thank you for not only this time of worship, but the time of opening your word. Thank you for the many ways you speak to us this morning, not the least of these through music, through scripture, and even through silence. And now as we open your word, may you open our hearts and our minds to your leading today. Thanksgiving, some would argue, is the easiest Sunday of the year to preach. All you got to do is say, God tells us to be thankful, read a couple of Psalms, and then tell a bunch of stories of Thanksgiving and the difference that Thanksgiving makes. And you know, if we do that, I think it's appropriate. Because when we start to utter the words of thanksgiving, it has a way of impacting us. I was in a conversation just within the last 24 hours with an individual who said, you know, I was feeling just awful down. I got a few problems with it, and they listed their problems. And I went home and I started thinking, I've got a house, I've got a place to lay down at night, I've got family, I've got friends, I've got food. What is wrong with me that I am doubting and that I am not offering words of thanks? And she said, but you know what happened? Just by merely raising my voice around that, I've had a different attitude the last couple of days. Yeah, it's easy if we step back and look at how God has blessed us. One of the problems we have is that it's hard to be thankful when I'm always comparing myself to the one that's next to me. I'm thankful for the house I've got, but boy, you should see the house that brother-in-law of mine has. Or I'm thankful for, and you can always find someone who has a little or a lot more and isn't using it in the way that you think should be used. Comparisons, well, we may need to keep score when we're playing football, but I don't think we need to when we are dealing with a spirit of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is difficult from a preacher's point of view because everything you say has already been said. And I think that's true. But isn't that true about everything in the gospel? I'm going to take a little detour today. But I believe it is in the heart and the spirit of thanksgiving. I'm going to talk about blessings. For I believe that blessings and thanksgiving are very connected. What is thanksgiving for a Christian? Isn't it acknowledging not just what we have, but what God has given us? And what is a blessing? Isn't a blessing, instead of looking back and saying thank you, a blessing is saying, God, I believe you're going to be involved in this situation, in this person's life, in this church, in this bread and fish that we have, and you're going to be involved in it, and it's not going to be the same. So it is. So it is with blessings. I was warned by 3 words. I didn't expect them. I've been in a difficult pastoral care situation. All those kind that most families have been through. There was one thing led to another thing, and into the hospital, and then the intensive care, and then decisions had to be made, and it was not an easy thing, and I walked with these parishioners through it. But I wasn't ready for the last conversation from a son who said, God bless you. And I wanted to say, hold it, you've got it all wrong. I'm the guy that works for God. I do the blessing, you just accept it. But for once, God slowed my tongue down, and my brain was already slow, and I let him go on. And what I realized, that in those words, he was acknowledging that he had been blessed and that God was blessing him and his family as they moved ahead. Even in the midst of a situation that no one wanted to go through. It was about 50 years ago that I made a rash decision and purchased a convertible one afternoon. Now, Susan's car was on its last legs, and I happened to be going by a Chrysler dealership that said 3 more convertibles left. I went in. I realized that one of the salesmen had infrequently attended a church that I was pastoring, and I used that as a sign from God that I should buy the car. Now, I made a very smart decision. I told Susan it was hers, but I really wanted it. And there's some great things about convertibles. Now, they're not so great in the winter and the ice and all of that, but in the summer when you put that top down, you can just look out and enjoy all of God's gift and God's grace. And creation takes a new step forward. One day I was coming back from a pastoral call at a hospital. I had her convertible. I pulled up to a stoplight. I looked into the sky. The stars were there. Everything was great. And I was soaking in all of God's creation. And then, the guy behind me laid on the horn as if to tell me, we're not here to enjoy God's grace. We are here to move down the road. And as he moved by, the convertible, well, there are advantages to convertibles and disadvantages. I was able to hear everything that he said. And he was going to redirect my eternal destiny and a few other things. I say that to say we live in a culture that finds it easier to damn us than to bless us. Now, I could argue a little thing like being at a stoplight 10 seconds too long. Well, but I could see myself in the role of the one that went by. Our society, we can give lots of reasons and try to understand, but it's much better at attacking than it is praising. Perhaps the power of the blessing that I received that other day had brought me more in touch with blessings because we get so few of them. The church, God's church, is in the blessing business, not the damning business. Oh, I'm not going to get into a whole theology of where we go and all of the things that go with that. But Christ came to bless us. We deal with the reality of forgiveness and hope and grace and moving forward. And we have formalized those in baptisms. And what we're really saying is, God bless you. Not only has God dealt with you in the past, but God bless you as you move forward. Whether we're talking about a little child or we're talking about an adult. When we come in to receive the sacrament of communion, aren't we really coming to be blessed? We're coming to participate in the mystery of God's grace in a way that we don't fully understand, but I think the word blessing fits there. And when we've gone away, don't we remember and aren't we thankful? And when we leave a service, we do a benediction, which is really a blessing. We need a blessing. We need to be reminded that God is involved in our lives as we move ahead. A prayer at a hospital, a prayer with a friend, is really a blessing. For it's asking God to be involved in that person's life at that time. In our United Methodist Book of Worship, there are a multitude of blessings. Blessings for birthdays, blessings for new school years, blessings for new houses, blessings for graduates, blessings for entering into retirement, blessings of the animals. And what do all of those have in common? They are asking God to be involved. A Jewish website that I came across had 36 well-crafted blessings. Let me highlight a couple of them that I had not been ready for. The first was a blessing on hearing bad news. Now, I don't want to hear bad news, so if I hear it, midst of bad news, we need to be reminded that God is with us. Isn't there some truth in that? Or a blessing on seeing the ocean. I have never lived next to the ocean. I have seen oceans. But I lived on the shores within a half a mile on a hill from Lake Superior when I was in Marquette. There was a real blessing there. When you see the waves come in and all of that. And to be reminded that God is larger than I can control. Or I can't control the waves and the storms. How can I control others? What should we offer blessings for? An Episcopal pastor in New York at St. Clement's Church was criticized for offering a blessing to an acting troop. The rector responded, if you can bless blessings for a fox hunt, you can surely give a blessing for human beings who are trying to be free. I think he's got an argument there. When I was pastoring at Court Street, United Methodist Church, downtown Flint, there was a alarm system in that building, and the Flint police would not go inside the building unless there was someone there to let them in. That was just part of their policy. And I was number 3 on the list. There was a custodian, there were a couple of custodians, and if they couldn't answer, it came to me. And I am convinced that the bad guys in that area knew when the other 2 were on vacation or weren't going to answer their phone or whatever. I sat there and waited and waited and waited, and the police came and they wanted to go in the building, and they went in the building, and I think they even had a dog with them. We had one door that if you shook it real hard, it would pop open and you could go in. But what would happen is the kids that were doing this would go inside, and then the alarms go off, and then they leave. So we almost never found anyone in the building. When they had cleared the building, a young man, a police officer, came over to me. He was probably in his middle 20s. He reminded me of my son, and he looked at me and he said, "Father, will you bless me?" And I all of a sudden kicked in, "Hey, I don't have anything against Catholics, but I'm not a Catholic. Go to your priest. He does that." Well, again, before I said that, I looked into the eyes of that young man and I realized who more needed a blessing. For the next call that he goes on may not be one where there's no one in. It may be one where his life could hang in the balance. He may be thinking about his son and his wife and where all of that would be. And I offered a prayer of blessing. I was asked at a funeral to offer a blessing. I do that all the time. Blessing, praying over food or whatever. And then the lady that was running it, a good friend and parishioner, said, "Can you make it long? We don't have enough food, and we've sent someone out to get some more. So do one of your long prayers." I'm not sure she'd gotten a hold of the message of blessing being God's involvement, but she had a very real, practical problem. A problem that the disciples had when the 5,000 men were there and were hungry. There may have been 15, 20, 25,000 people all together. It was read for our scripture reading today. I'm going to direct us to that blessing and to a second blessing that comes in the Old Testament, a blessing by Samuel of David. Samuel was the voice of God in ancient Israel. Saul was the first king, and he, like a lot of politicians, had lost his way politically and, more important, spiritually. God sent Samuel to bless a future king. They went to the family of Jesse. God had directed them there, and Jesse had all of these fine young men, and they were all lined up, and they were wearing Sunday best, and they had washed their hair, and all that goes with that, and they were paraded in front of Samuel. And Samuel said, "They're all fine young men, but they're not the one that God wants to bless with this specific task." Is there not another one? And finally, the father said, well, yeah, but he's just a kid. He's out taking care of sheep. He's not old enough to know what's going on. And one of the older brothers piped in, he's the youngest, and we don't much trust them. And Samuel says, well, go get him. And they went and got him, and they cleaned him up and brought him before Samuel. And Samuel blessed him as the future king of the nation of Israel. Yes, that blessing. It was a unique blessing, for it wasn't the end of problems that were going to come. It was in some sense more of a beginning, but it was God's involvement in the life of this young man. Blessed. The greatest king in the history of Israel. One who was said of God, saying he had a heart like unto God's. That was the power of the blessing of God's involvement in his life as it moved forward. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 is, for me, one of the great stories of Scripture. It was time to eat. There was no caterer. There was no McDonald's. Send them to town, said the disciples. We're here to deal with religious things. But it was poor planning. I don't know who was in charge of food, but all they had was a boy that came forward with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And those loaves were probably closer to the size of saltine crackers. And Jesus said, I'll bless it. Can you imagine being one of the disciples there? Now, Jesus, I followed you through all this, but I think you're getting over the edge. Well, he passed out the 12 baskets. And when they were done the baskets, and when they were done eating, 12 were left over. The power of a blessing is really the power of God's involvement in our lives for the one who is blessed. The blessing is really an acknowledgement of turning over to God the situation. David turned his life over to God, and look what would happen. I don't think anyone could imagine it was going to be real, but it did, and he went on to be a great leader with warts and all, but a great leader. And the fishes and the loaves, why, who would have dreamed they would accomplish what they did? For a blessing is a calling upon the resources of God. And we underestimate what those resources are, don't we? In David's life, one would not have expected him to ascend to king, even with a prophet saying so. To the 5,000, I think we would have said, let me be first in line, because I'm a little bit concerned about the second and third rows and all of those later. The results of God's blessing are usually beyond our expectation. Did David's family expect him to be the greatest king in Israel? I doubt it. He was the youngest. The disciples passing out the fish and the loaves, did they grab a bite first, expecting the food to run out? Or did they anticipate that those in the second row would have nothing to eat? We underestimate who we are dealing with. I spent my 3 years in Asbury Seminary in Kentucky working for United Parcel Service. It was a job that paid phenomenally in the early 70s. You worked 3 hours, and I worked the midnight shift most of the time, from 11 o'clock at night to 2 in the morning. You worked as hard as you could. The supervisors were hired by their ability to yell and to not feel guilty about what they called you. Most of the time we just took it because we made more money than someone would working full time on minimum wage, which were most of the jobs in that part of Kentucky at that time. But one night, 8 or 10 of us from the seminary out of the 75 that were there, the others were almost all University of Kentucky people, had just about enough, and there was a confrontation, and we threatened to walk out, and a whole bunch of things happened. And we got our union rep. Now, we remember the Teamsters. We got our union rep involved. And he was a graduate student, a mild-mannered kid, and we got him involved. And things went nowhere. The plant manager said, you listen to the supervisor or you're out of here. And finally someone said, we need to go talk to our union rep. So we had this mild-mannered graduate student who looked like he could be blown away if someone blew very hard at him. He developed a speech for the union leader. And he went and met with this gentleman. He was the epitome of a leader in that position coming out of the 1930s or 40s movies. He was very overweight. He had a cigar in his mouth, tattoos, and language that was not appropriate in a building like this. But the union rep was there. And he laid out what had happened, and he was looking for a resolution. That union boss leaned back. He took a cigar out of his mouth and he tapped it. He reached in his drawer and he pulled out an old 45. Not a 45 record, a 45 gun. And he said, I've used this for the Brotherhood before and I'll use it again. And our union rep said, well, we were kind of thinking of a letter of reprimand. Do you see the disconnect there? Do you see the disconnect? We were asking for a letter, and he was ready to go overboard on the other side. Now, I'm not saying that we should go around shooting people who talk and try to get more work out of us. But I think it connects with how we see the blessings from God. The blessings from God are much hotter and have much more power in them than we could ever imagine. We're asking God's blessing, thinking a letter or a nice word will do it. And God is saying, I'm the one that can make this kid king. I can feed 15 or 20 or 30,000 people with a boy's lunch. And you're asking me to just smile and maybe write something. Where does that leave us today? I believe in God's blessing. What God is doing is interacting in our lives and calling us to allow God to interact in our lives. Are we ready to be part of the feeding of the 5,000? Or are we only asking for a McDonald's value meal? Are we ready to have the youngest of us to be used of God to the greatness of Israel and the nation? Are we ready to be the disciples that pass out the loaves and the fishes, even if they don't really understand what it means? No, the God that we worship is a God that blesses, and in that blessing offers us and offers His creation the full resources of His love and His grace. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that the mere words of a blessing are going to have all of us win the lottery, even if we don't play it. But I do believe that when we seek or receive God's blessing, God is in the business not merely of nodding and smiling and saying, Sonny, it's going to be all right. But God is in the business of interacting with us in ways that change the world. Can you imagine the impact on those disciples when they had that food and Jesus blessed it? And then it fed all of them. Even if everybody else didn't realize what was going on, they realized it. And even if they put it in the back of their mind for the years to come, when crucifixion was there and the resurrection, they began to see they were dealing with something larger than themselves. My prayer for you and for me, for all of us, is for God to bless us and us to be ready to receive that blessing